Hey, welcome here or welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show you how I did my Halloween zombie bride set. This video includes 3 dresses, 3 rings, 3 stones, and a bouquet. I will make sure to list all the materials needed in the description below. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Dress 1. This dress is sort of a nod to a witch dress that I created last year. To see the actual dress I made last year, go to my IG at Tori Made It. Before you start decorating the cookie, you have to cut out small to medium-sized squares of wafer paper, and you spritz them with a very small amount of water, and I mean very small amount. Then you will sort of fold the sides together. They will stick because the water makes the wafer paper sticky. You can also roll the paper. I learned this technique from Anna Astishkina. Now, once you have your wafer paper pieces, flood the bottom of your dress with black flood consistency icing. This black on black looks so cool. I use black cocoa to make these cookies, but if you don't have that, you can add black food coloring to your dough. While your icing is still wet, you're going to add the pieces of wafer paper on top of it. Now I use a mixture of sizes. I grab the bigger pieces to cover the bottom of the dress. As I go, I'm adjusting the wafer paper because it does slide a bit since the icing is still wet. I add the smallest pieces at the top, so the skirt will look like it's gradually getting bigger. And these little pieces are also good for filling in areas that aren't full enough. Let the area dry. Then you're going to color it with an airbrush. Here I'm using my portable airbrush because it's easier to use with the camera in the way. If you don't have an airbrush, you can also dry dust this section. I start with the light layer of color. It looks really green on here, but it's not that bad when you see it in person. And the more color I add, the blacker it looks. We're going to let this dry, which is pretty quick. I just left this in here because I thought the outline was funny. Then we flood the top. Now I use some edible lace to accent the top of the dress. I used the same silicone mat I used on last year's dress. I'll link that and the video of where I learned to make edible lace in the description below. Cut the lace to fit across the chest area. Add the neck piece and dust it with some cornstarch. Dress 1 is done. Dress number 2. Just like the other dress, we start by flooding the bottom of this dress with flood consistency icing. Now this style represents the shorter wedding dress. I don't know why, but I kind of pictured this dress on a rocker zombie bride. For this dress, I used edible fabric. I'll be sure to link the video below where I learned how to make it. I colored it black, Then I dusted it with cornstarch to give it a worn, dirty look. I cut the pieces in all different shapes because I wanted the dress to look shredded and torn. While the icing is still wet, attach the pieces in layers starting from the bottom. On the top, use a wider piece to cover all the loose pieces so to have that smooth layered look. Well, sort of smooth because it's still torn. Use the rest of the pieces to fill in any areas that might look thin. From there, we're going to flood the top. Once that's dry, add the belt, which is just a line of flood consistency icing across the cookie. Now I wanted to add a little bling, so I used silver sanding sugar and a flat silver sprinkle to put in the middle. It's supposed to look like a brooch. The top seemed a little too neat for me, so I outlined it with thick black consistency icing, then used the same icing with a damp brush to create texture on the top. Once that was done and dry, I dusted it with a little bit of cornstarch to match the bottom. And this dress is done. Dress number 3, the last dress. Now I wanted a smooth look for this dress, so I decided to try rice paper. I dipped the rice paper in water with a little bit of black food coloring. Now on my first attempt, I tried just outlining the cookie with icing and putting the rice paper right on top of it. But that just turned out to be a terrible wet mess. So on attempt number 2, I decided to flood the bottom of the cookie like I did the other dresses. But this time I let the royal icing dry, so the bottom would have a bit of a puff to it. I laid a new piece of rice paper on the cookie and arranged the rice paper the way I wanted the folds to lay. From there, I trimmed away all the excess. Now, I let this dry, and that is very important. Let this dry completely. Now, it took this bottom layer about 4 to 5 hours to completely dry, so be patient. If you look closely, you will see that the cookie is moving when I'm trying to measure the lace, and as I'm flooding it. That's because it's broken. The cookie wasn't fully dry from all my attempts of laying the wet rice paper on it, so I had to flood it and cut the lace around it very gently. Now I cut the fabric on the cookie because I wanted it to fall over the sides like a real dress would. Again, still being gentle. Once the cookie was completely dried, it was as good as before. So I dusted it with cornstarch, and this cookie is done. Now it's time for the stones. I told y'all it was a lot. With these, we're just going to flood them with gray flood consistency icing. Once they are dry, trace the letters using a projector. Usually, I just use my royal icing to outline the letters straight from the projector, but for some reason, the letters were a little blurry. So I traced them with an edible marker first because it's easier to wipe away any mistakes. Then I went over it with my medium consistency icing. This is a great way to write on cookies if you don't have a steady hand to copy straight from the projector. Okay, funny thing about these stones, they were never a part of the original set. I added them in later because it seemed like it was missing something and I had extra dough left over. So I looked up some cute wedding sayings and gave them a spooky twist. Okay, back to decorating this cookie. Next, I used some of my Turkish black dust and a dry brush to give the stones an aged, dirty look. I used my thick royal icing to create what I thought would be vines, but they look more like cracks, so we'll just go with that. Follow the same steps for the other two stones. Here's a look at the complete set. Ooh, creepy. Next are the rings, but before we do that, I wanted to show you how I made the stones. I used fondant. Now, when using fondant, make sure you wear gloves. I didn't for this video, but trust me, it will make things a lot easier. The first stone is made with the skeleton mold. Just pop the fondant in, make sure it's flat. I let it set for about 30 seconds, then pop it out. And here's a look at the completed skeleton. The next stone was a snake. So to make the snake, I took a small piece of the fondant and rolled it into a thick noodle between my hands, then placed it on the table, but you should use a mat. Continue to roll it out thinner. This will be a lot easier on a mat. Once it's thin enough, scrunch the ends together until it looks like a wiggly worm. Where you want the head, flatten it a bit. Add a tiny piece of fondant to it. Also make the neck area a little bit skinnier so it looks more realistic. And then straighten out the nose area. I did this with my finger for the video because no one's eating it, but you can use any small flat tool. For the bug, I used the same fondant. I just rolled out two small ovals, one slightly bigger than the other, and attached them using a little bit of water. I added the legs with royal icing once I put it on top of the ring box. Now for the ring box, I learned this technique from Maya from Painted Lady Pastries. She has a whole tutorial on it on her Instagram. But here's my speedy way of doing it. Everything here is done with flood consistency icing, except for the outline. I used thick consistency icing for that and made the little ridges with my scribe tool. These white lines are supposed to represent the band of the ring. That's why I painted them silver. Now, once I added the skull, I realized I messed up. I made the silver parts too long. So here's how I fixed it. I used my scribe tool to shorten the two silver lines. Then I used a bit of burgundy royal icing to paint over the exposed area. Now, once it dried completely, I used some of the same dust and the same dry brush to create the worn, dirty look on the box. Then I used some cornstarch on top of the skull so it will look dusty as well. Follow the same steps for the other two ring boxes, minus the mistakes I made. Here's a look at the complete ring set. These are so hot. Now for the very last part of the set. Look guys, we made it. I'm laughing too much, and this is supposed to be a scary set. Anyway, for the bouquet, I used fondant and a fondant mold for this cookie. I flipped the flower around for the best fit and attached it using water. For a second, I forgot she was a zombie bride and I started painting the flowers bright red. But I figured I can dust over it later, so I went with it. Since I already committed to the red flowers, I just colored the leaves green too. I'm not sure if you noticed, but I didn't use the stem part of the mold, and that's because I wanted to cover this area with wafer paper. So I put down some black royal icing and let it dry. I covered it with slightly wet wafer paper. Now this should look shredded as well. From there, I dusted the flowers, the leaves, and the paper with edible black dust. Watching this back, all I could think is if I would have remembered to paint the roses brown or black, I would have saved a lot of time. But the bright side is, here's another way to achieve a cool dark rose look. And we're done. Sheesh, this video is a whole class. But isn't it beautiful? Now, which zombie Halloween wedding dress would you say yes to? Tell me in the comments. And if you stuck around for this whole video, thank you. And if you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe. Talk to you in the next one. Peace.